happens between now and 2028 is that there is always an end game to democracy. And the end game is, how does an aspiring dictator actually finally shut the door on democracy? And it's not easy to do, because citizens don't want to give up their rights and freedoms. And so if they think they're losing, that democracy is about to disappear, they'll fight against that. So the strategy that you see these aspiring dictators pursue time and time again is they seek a crisis or an emergency, or they manufacture a crisis or a war. Netanyahu is doing that right now in the Middle East to keep himself in power. But it could also be something like the Charlie Kirk murder, where you use this, and we have a name for people who use, they're violence entrepreneurs. You use a violent episode to, one, demonize your opponent, say, oh my gosh, look, they're animals, or they're dangerous, or they're going to kill you. And two, to convince people that power needs to be centralized, to declare a state of emergency, to declare martial law. And people will almost always trade freedom for security. And so I don't think this is that Reichstag moment, and I write about it in my Substack newsletter. This is not the Reichstag moment, but I think there will be a moment between now and 2028 where Trump finds some crisis and uses it to scare the bejesus out of Americans and convince them that he needs to gain more power to protect them, and Americans are going to give it to him.
I've read that a lot of times that these individuals think that they're, in order to capture social capital, believe that this is sort of a heroic act of violence. I've also noticed a pattern with political violence, that it tends to be young men, young white men. And I'm curious also, have you done any studies connecting online behavior and a certain type of online behavior with either political violence or just mass shootings in general?
I haven't done that particular research. Interestingly enough, Facebook has. Do you remember a few Decembers back, there was a whistleblower, a Facebook employer named Frances Haugen, who turned over tens of thousands of pages of internal Facebook documentation to Congress and to the Wall Street Journal. And those documents outlined the internal experiments and studies that Facebook had done with the universe of the data that only Facebook has access to. And they looked at the effects of online time on a whole host of outcomes, from depression to anxiety to violence. And, not surprisingly, they found that the more time you spent on Facebook and I assume other social media outlets, and again, you'd have to look at the content they were looking at, the more likely you were to experience a lot of these negative outcomes. So Facebook knows that. We also found out recently that Facebook suppressed information they had about the effects of social media on children. So we know that spending hours and hours a day alone in your living room or in your bedroom, watching violent videos or engaging in really extremist chat rooms does increase how radical you ultimately become and how likely you are to use violence. So, and then to get back to young men, the vast majority of this type of violence is committed by young men, and young men are spending more and more time online. And in some ways, it's really it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Here are all these, um, you know. Young men with promising futures. This was an A student. He got a full scholarship to college. He had his whole world ahead of him, and yet most of his time increasingly was spent online. And we'll find out exactly what he was looking at and what he was engaging in. But we know that does not make for healthy, well-adjusted, peaceful people.
There's been a lot of discussion or a lot of rhetoric around, kind of this is war. And then Some other people saying that it feels that one of the reasons this just feels so awful is it feels like there's a sense in the air that we may be on the precipice of something just very bad. And you have actually studied
Yeah.
and around the world, and what are the kind of you've studied them globally. When you look at America today, what parallels or kind of warning signs do you see?
Well, I'll start with the underlying conditions. For 5 years, between 2017 and 2021, I served on a task force run by the CIA called the Political Instability Task Force. And one of the goals of that task force was to come up with a model that would help the US government predict what types of countries were likely to experience political violence and political instability within the next 2 years. And when this model was created, you had two types of people on the task force. You had experts on conflict like myself, and you had data analysts who worked for the agency. And the data analysts asked the expert to they asked them to tell them everything we thought might potentially lead a country down the path towards war. And we gave them 38 different factors. So we actually didn't know which were the most important ones. So things like poverty, whether a country heavily discriminated against a particular group, whether a country was ethnically homogeneous or not, all sorts of stuff. And the analysts went away. And when they came back, they said, it turns out only two conditions were highly predictive. And they were not the conditions that the experts expected. The first condition is something we called anocracy. All that means is a partial democracy. So the vast majority of political violence, the vast majority of civil wars, do not happen in healthy democracies, and they do not happen in full autocracies. They happen in between, in this middle zone where a country has some elements of democracy and they have some elements of autocracy. And they especially happen in these anocracies if they're rapidly moving from one side to another. So if you have a democracy that's rapidly declining, that puts it at risk of political violence. If you have an autocracy that's rapidly democratizing, think about Yugoslavia in the 1990s, that's where you get political violence. So that's the most important feature. Do you have a weak and rapidly changing type democracy? The second is whether citizens in those anocracies were basically choosing political party based on race, religion, or ethnicity rather than on ideology. So you're joining a political party not mostly because you're conservative or liberal, but you're joining because you're Black or white or Muslim or Christian or Serb or Croat. So if a country had these two features, it was a partial democracy with these identity-based political parties. The task force put that country on a watch list. And we called it the watch list, and we considered it at high risk of political violence and instability within the next 2 years. So if you take those underlying conditions and you think about the United States today, the United States is now solidly in the anocracy zone based on the measure we used on the task force. We are no longer considered by any group that studies democracy a full democracy. We are in this middle zone. If you look at our political parties, they started breaking down into by race and religion starting around 2018. It got a little bit better in the last election where Latino men and African American men gravitated from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party, but I suspect that's going to go back in the next election. So, by both of these measures, the United States is in this high risk category today. Those are the underlying conditions. So, then look at the more immediate conditions. So, what tends to trigger civil war? What tends to trigger civil war? Often contested elections. It's elections that people don't trust, elections that are very close, and elections that have this sort of winner take all, zero sum feeling to them. that if you lose the election, there might never be another election again, and you might permanently be shut out of power. When you have that surrounding elections, people tend to start to give up on playing by the rules, and the more extreme elements in the parties and their message, which is, the system is broken, we're never going to fix it, violence is justified, that message begins to resonate with the more moderate members of the party, and that's when you start to get in trouble.
Support for the show comes from LinkedIn. We say this all the time on our show, but it bears repeating. Running a small business isn't just a full-time job. It's about a dozen full-time jobs that you rarely, if ever, get to clock out of, at least until you get to the point where you can start hiring the dream team. And if you've made it that far, you already know there's no time to mess around. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share with your network, and get qualified candidates that you can manage all in one place. And LinkedIn's new AI feature can even help you write job descriptions and then quickly get it in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And if you decide you want to go to the extra mile to find the perfect candidate, LinkedIn says that promoted jobs get 3 times the number of qualified applicants. It's all these little things that let you find help fast without compromising on quality, which add up to you finally having extra time in the day for, relaxing. Or, knowing my listeners, you'll probably use that extra time to expand your empire even further. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/prof. That's linkedin.com/prof to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Support for the show comes from Built Rewards. Paying rent every month can sometimes feel like you're just sending your money into the void, never to be seen again. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you're paying rent without earning anything in return, allow me to introduce you to Built Rewards. Built is a rewards program designed for renters who want to earn something for their largest monthly expense. By paying rent through Built, you earn flexible points that can be redeemed towards hundreds of hotels and airlines, a future rent payment, your next Lyft ride, and more. But it doesn't stop there. Built wants to make your entire neighborhood more rewarding. You can dine out at your favorite local restaurants and earn additional points, get VIP treatment at certain fitness studios, and enjoy exclusive experiences just for Built members every month. Built is turning a monthly expense into an opportunity to earn rewards and discover the best that your neighborhood has to offer. Your rent is finally working for you. Earn points on rent and around your neighborhood wherever you call home by going to joinbuilt.com/profg. That's joinbilt.com/profg. Make sure to use the URL so they know we sent you. I think that's fascinating, this notion of an anocracy, and that is somewhere in between. If you're Singapore, China, or Russia, quite frankly, not a lot of risk. If you're, Japan or Canada, healthy democracy, but the hybrid in between isn't a good place to be. I think that's really fascinating. The second thing you mentioned that I didn't get a strong feel for whether we're there or not is when there's racial divisiveness. Do you feel, a lot of this rhetoric is positioned as white Christian nationalists. Obviously, non-whites tend to gravitate, I think, towards a more progressive viewpoint. Well, I'll stop there. Do you think we fit the conditions for that second criteria?
It's really interesting. I thought by this time, Donald Trump in his second term, we would clearly fit that criteria because Donald Trump in his first term was more upfront. I thought about supporting the white nationalist agenda. He sort of lauded the rioters or the people who were parading in Charlottesville in 2017. And he's stepped back a bit with that, and I think he's realized that, for example, the Latino community could be a potential voting bloc for him. He hasn't really, his immigration rates have disproportionately affected non-whites, but I think he's a little more sensitive to the fact that Latinos helped him win. They're the fastest growing population here in the United States. They're not going away. and he doesn't want to alienate them too much. And because the white population is declining compared to other groups in the United States, the Republican Party needs to reach across racial and religious lines, and so I think he's been a little more sensitive to that. But having said that, after the 2020 election, if you looked at who voted, how Americans vote, the vast majority of Black Americans voted Democrat. They still do. A majority of Latinos vote Democrat. A large majority of Muslims and Jews and Asians vote Democrat. And whites overwhelmingly vote Republican. It was about 80% of whites voted Republican, and this is in a country that's multi-ethnic and multi-religious. So that really starts to meet this criteria of identity-based rather than ideologically based. And also, when you look at who gravitated towards the Republican Party over the last 10, 15 years, it was working class whites. And ideologically, they would be much better served by the Democrats. So they're choosing the Republican Party for a whole host of other reasons unrelated, what would be in their economic and social interests.
So, what's your sense of things? Do you feel that the table is set for something, and revolutions can take on different forms, right? Or civil war can take on different forms. Do you think the table has been set for some sort of civil unrest that only gets worse and worse? Or like most things, will the half-life of this be a few weeks and we'll move on to the next big thing?
I wish I didn't have to say this. I think we're actually in a really very tough, bad spot. And I'll tell you why. America has experienced political violence throughout our history. And in the 60s, we saw that. But the response was almost always uniform. If we go back even to the 1990s, in the 1990s, we started to see the rise of violent extremist militias in the United States, and Americans didn't see this until the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and that sort of threw them into the limelight. And the response to that by American citizens was absolute horror, absolute condemnation. It didn't matter what drove this person, it didn't matter what political affiliation he had. All Americans condemned that violence. Um, the second thing that happened was it activated the FBI to aggressively go after militia groups across the country, and figure out who the leaders were, figure out where they were organizing, and really, in some respects, neutralize them. So if you look at 1995, it was the peak of militias in the United States until recently. And after the FBI started focusing on this problem, we saw a pretty consistent and rapid decline. That is not happening today. We've seen the rise of militias pretty quickly since about 2008, with the election of Barack Obama. And now we're seeing a series of domestic terror attacks. And the response isn't by the FBI, let's look at the problem that we have and let's root it out and let's figure out what's driving this. And the response by Americans is not, this is absolutely terrible. You're seeing pockets saying this is war. We need to get retribution. We need to eliminate the enemy. And this is not a healthy dynamic. We need to treat this in a unified way, that violence in whatever guise, especially politically motivated violence, is not acceptable, and the FBI needs to address that. And we have an FBI that is politically motivated and not necessarily interested in rooting out all types of violence.
Support for the show comes from Vanta. As a founder, you're moving fast toward product market fit, your next round, or your first big enterprise deal. But with AI accelerating how quickly startups build and ship, your security expectations are higher earlier than ever. Getting security and compliance right can unlock growth or stall it if you wait too long. Vanta is a trust management platform that helps businesses automate security and compliance with deep integrations and automated workflows built for fast-moving teams. So whether you're a startup tackling your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or an enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta's trust management platform makes it quicker, easier, and more scalable. The results? According to an IDC study, Vanta customers slash over $500,000 a year in costs. Establishing trust isn't optional. Vanta makes it automatic. Go to vanta.com/ProfG to save $1,000 today through the Vanta for Startups program and join over 10,000 ambitious companies already scaling with Vanta. That's VANTA.com/ProfG to save $1,000 for a limited time. You're a full-time prof. I spend a lot of time on campus, and there seems to be a very disturbing trend among students where they seem more accepting to the notion of violence as a means of countering what they see as violence, and that is words. And today, student acceptance of violence to silent speakers is at a record high. 1 in 3 students say violence is acceptable to stop a speaker, up from 1 in 5 in 2020. What do you account for the change, or what do you think is responsible for the change?
I think the single biggest factor that's driving a lot of the breakdown of societal norms and societal threads and societal decency and civility is the internet. If you look at countries, if you look at democracies, if you look at speech, it really didn't start to unravel and get really heated and negative and uncompromising until about the late 2000s, and that of course is the introduction of the smartphone, and the rise of people's reliance on social media for most of their news. And then when you started to have algorithms that were, when the tech companies figured out that they could design algorithms that would push information into people's hands that was sort of addictive, information that they couldn't keep their eyes off of, that kept them tied to their phones. That information was, in many cases, the most emotionally charged, the most incendiary. It's information that was designed to ramp up people's um, emotions and sense of fight or flight. And I don't think it's a surprise that 20 years later, we have a society that is much more distrustful of each other, distrustful of the system, um, um, isolated from each other, and I think that's what we're seeing. So I think that's the biggest reason, is that a lot of these kids are getting their information from, from social media sites, and they're being fed only a very particular segment of information, and they come to believe that, and it's delivered to them in the most impassioned way, which of course makes them particularly impassioned as well. And then you see them come on campus and they've spent hours and hours and hours online talking to people who agree with them and tell them nothing different. And then they hear something different. They've also been told that those people are wrong and dangerous, and they're ready to go to battle. So that's, I think, a big part of it. I actually think universities have done a terrible job educating students and taking this issue head on, and talking about the importance of free speech, teaching students about debate, teaching students to listen to arguments and to take them seriously, and then to debate the ideas in a reasonable, logical way. I think we've basically, not thrown our hands up. I think we've basically decided that maybe that was too hard, or it might get us in trouble. Universities aren't really known, and professors aren't really known to be the most courageous people, and I think it's just easier to just put our heads down and think that life is going to continue as it always has. And now we're seeing the effects of that.
Like most people, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I want to put forward a thesis on what the root causes are. And you've already touched on a few and have you respond to it, and then move to what some potential solutions might be. I see the three legs of the stool here, if you will, as one, what we've been talking about, and that is a connection between algorithms that promote incendiary content and rage to profit.
Mhm.
We used to think sex sells. Actually, we found something that sells better, and it's rage. And the algorithms have figured that out and pit us against each other, and it's worked. We now believe that it's not Russians pouring over the border in Ukraine or the CCP or income inequality or climate change that is our enemy. It's our neighbor who has different political beliefs than us. And then two, young men who are really struggling in our nation. Lack of economic and romantic opportunities. Biologically, prefrontal cortex doesn't catch up to a woman's until they're 25. Lack of male role models. An education system, I would argue, that is somewhat biased against them, lack of economic opportunities. And then you pair that with number one, they begin to sequester from society. And like any mammal, when they're not surrounded by other relationships, they start to go, quite frankly, crazy, similar to an orca in a tank alone, or leave your dog alone for a day and see what happens.
Yeah.
And then the kicker to all of this, we don't have a monopoly on the first two. What we do have a monopoly on is divisive content, struggling men who have access to the guns. I found this crazy stat in the U.S. I'm in London right now. In the U.K., there's going to be 30 gun deaths this year. There's 120 a day in the United States. So since Charlie Cook's assassination or murder 2 days ago, there's already been 8 times the number of gun deaths in the U.S. that there will be all year in the U.K. Where do I have that wrong, and what color would you add to that?
It is absolutely right, and I couldn't state it better than you just stated it. And the only thing I'll add is if the gunman who killed Charlie Kirk hadn't had access to the internet, if this was pre-2008, the world that you and I grew up in, and he didn't have access to guns, he would still be in college and he'd still have a future ahead of him, and Charlie Kirk would still be alive. He would not have been radicalized. All of these poor kids, most of them are, young men, are being radicalized online, and the radicalization pipeline goes straight through the 5 biggest tech companies of the world, all of which are American.
What you just said is so powerful. I hadn't thought of it that way. I mean, it's just so obvious, but I think that's what real insight is you say just something obvious that it's obvious after you hear it. And that is, if this kid hadn't had access to the internet, he would be a scholarship student and wouldn't be spending the rest of his life in prison. And Charlie Kirk, a father of 2, would still be alive. I can't stop thinking, as a parent of 2 boys, I guess some combination of family members and friends basically figured out that he had done it. And can you imagine that drive to the prison to turn?
No, I can't. Actually, it breaks my heart. This
As a
whole
parent?
thing breaks my heart. It breaks
Oh
my
my
heart for
God.
everybody involved. And
I can't even
yeah,
imagine. But that is just so, I think that's just so, I just hadn't thought of it that way. That if this kid hadn't had access to the internet, most likely this just wouldn't have happened. So let's move to solutions. You are on these task forces. You're not
yeah.
only helping to identify for our intelligence apparatus what nations are vulnerable, such that we can plan. What if you were asked to serve on another task force, and my guess is you probably will be, that said, all right, what are some common sense solutions to reduce political violence, the likelihood of civil war? I won't even go to gun violence, because that's just, let's talk about political violence and reduce the likelihood of civil war. What would you suggest are 2 or 3 programs that the government should be considering?
So, Scott, there are lots of common sense solutions. The problem is we don't have common sense politicians right now on either side. And I'll tell you why. Um, we know from the government, the U.S. government's own task force, that if you have a strong, healthy democracy, you don't experience this type of violence. You actually experience peace and prosperity, like the United States has done for certainly since the end of World War II, and for Black Americans since the Civil Rights Movement. Um, so that is the single most important thing we can do, is to strengthen our democracy. But if you look back, we know all the really undemocratic features of the American government. Everybody knows what needs to be changed. We need to get rid of gerrymandering. We need to reform the Senate. We need to get rid of the Electoral College. We absolutely have to get big money out of politics. When Biden came into power in 2020, the Democrats controlled all three branches of government, right? And they knew that democracy was in trouble here in the United States, and they were not able to get a single reform passed. So our democracy was no stronger after Joe Biden left office than it was beforehand. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we're not going to reform our democracy anytime soon. The Democrats either aren't able to reform it or aren't willing to reform it, and the Republicans are not going to reform it because they disproportionately benefit from the current system. So then go to the second fact, which is, these identity-based politics can really create a very combustible political atmosphere. Well, I mean, maybe, right? Maybe Trump and the Republicans will increasingly reach across religious and racial lines. But then they're going to face the same problem that Democrats faced in the 1960s. If they reach and across racial and religious lines, they're going to lose a big portion of their base, and a big portion of their base are conservative whites, and a subset of that are white nationalists. So they will fight having the Republican Party have a bigger tent. So that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So then, like, what would you do if I was on another task force and someone said, okay, give us a common sense solution that we can implement now that will almost certainly have a big and quick effect? Regulate the algorithms of social media, right? Again, like, the five biggest tech companies in the world are all American companies, and they are essentially unregulated. And we are increasingly seeing all the big negative societal effects that unregulated social media is having, not just on the American public, but on our democracy and on societies and democracies around the world. So that's what I would tell our politicians. I would say, have the courage to take on the tech companies. Give up the money that's pouring into your campaign coffers. Do what's right for America. Do what's right for your teenage boy. And don't allow them to basically control the minds and the limbic systems of our kids, and set them up um, for a life that will be more divided, more hate filled, less prosperous, more violent than they would have otherwise gotten.
I think we should leave it there. Barbara F. Walters is a professor at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy and a leading expert on civil wars, extremism, and domestic terrorism. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. She joins us from San Diego. I just want to repeat again what you said, and it was just so obvious, it really kind of was puncturing, that if this young man had not had access to the internet, it's unlikely that he would have taken the life of a father of two and be facing a life behind bars. He could have had a much different life.
Friday that the US added just 73,000 jobs in July and sharply revised the numbers for May and June downward. It was the largest downward revision since 1979, excluding COVID-era adjustments. Hours later, Trump fired the commissioner of that agency, accusing her of manipulating data. On Truth Social, he said it was rigged in order to, quote, make the Republicans and me look bad. He also claimed that she, quote, faked the jobs numbers before the election to try and boost Kamala's chances of victory. The markets did not like any of this news, and the latest tariff blitz only compounded the trouble. The Dow fell over 1%, the S&P 500 fell 1.6%, and the Nasdaq more than 2%. More than $1 trillion in value was erased on Friday. It was the stock market's worst day in over 2 months. So here we are. It's a new week, and Trump is now set to appoint a new BLS commissioner in the coming days. Now, the funniest part of all of this is that actually the July jobs numbers were not that bad. The real problem was this downward revision to the previous numbers. And what's so ironic about that is that this is the very thing that the Republicans used to accuse the Biden administration of doing, but in the other direction. The Republicans accused the Biden administration of fudging their original numbers and then quietly revising those numbers back down to the real number, which was all thought to be part of this deep state cover-up. Well, by that same logic, the commissioner was doing the same thing for Trump, the same thing she did for Biden. That is, come out with these great numbers in the initial report and then quietly revise them down later on. That was the thing that the Republicans complained about. But no, apparently that rule no longer applies. This time, it's the revision that is the fake number. And it's the initial number that's real. The revision downward was fake. The real number is the one that was good. Put another way, when the data looks good under Biden, the BLS is lying. And when the data looks bad under Trump, the BLS is lying. So the BLS is only telling the truth when it makes Trump look good. That is what he told us this week. It's not hyperbole. It's not TDS. That is the reality. So we have now officially entered the part where the leader shoots the messenger for bringing the bad news. Oh, my job numbers are bad? You're fired. You think tariffs cause inflation? You want to keep interest rates high? You're fired. This is where we are now. Now, you might be thinking, a lot of people are thinking, this story feels familiar. Where have I seen this story before? And you would be right. Because the reality, which I pointed out on MSNBC last week, the reality is that this is a chapter in the story of almost every iconic villain in history. And this is what Cersei Lannister does in Game of Thrones. This is what Commodus does in Gladiator. This is what Voldemort does in Harry Potter. You receive an inconvenient truth from a subordinate, and in a fit of anger, you shoot the messenger, be it through public execution or through the Cruciatus curse, or in this case, through firing. And to be clear, I'm not saying Trump is Voldemort. What I am saying, though, is that there is a reason that this has triggered such a strong emotional response from people and from the markets, and it's because they've seen this before in books and in movies and in cartoons. This is the classic evil dictator gets drunk on power move where you refuse to see the truth and you inflict pain on anyone who tries to put it in front of you. And I apologize for the hot take here, but the president behaving in ways that make him look like a Disney villain, I think that's kind of a bad thing. I think we should try to not have that. And by the way, it's not just cartoon villains that do this. It's real villains too. This is what Mao did when his generals told him that his policies were causing a nationwide famine. This is what Stalin did when his aides brought him bad news about the harvest. This is what Putin does today. This is what Kim Jong-un does today. This is what they all do. There is a reason why this is a theme in both reality and fiction. There's a reason why shoot the messenger is this well-known idiom. It's because it happens. It's a very convenient and effective strategy when you're in a position of power. If you need to lie about something, well, then it helps to have an incentive structure in your organization that promotes the lie. So punishing people who tell you the truth, that helps you. Rewarding people who tell the lie, that helps you too. That's why we see this over and over and over again. Nothing ever really changes. And so why on this occasion would we pretend that this is any different? I mean, seriously, this is getting out of control. And I know the comments are going to say he has Trump derangement syndrome. He's crying again online. Oh, I thought this was a markets show. Why isn't he talking about markets? I am talking about markets. We're talking about the jobs numbers, but the president just said the jobs numbers are fake. So yeah, we can't gloss over this very important detail. If we're going to talk about the economic data, we have to at least agree that the economic data is real. And apparently we don't. And the worst part about all of this, once we have Trump's pick for BLS chief, you just know it. All the liberals are going to say the same thing that the Republicans said. They're going to say, nope, the data is compromised. The data is fake. That's where we're at. So look, we were already entering into a post-truth world where, the line between data and narrative was already getting pretty blurry. But as of last week, I'm sorry to say, we have officially been blasted through the door. We're there now. Any data that comes out of the government, that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics or any other government agency, as of now, that data is a matter of opinion. And that is a world that we're actually not familiar with. Perhaps Argentina is, perhaps China is, although if you start debating the data and you're an economist, you get disappeared. That's what happens there. But we are not familiar with this in America. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that's going to mean for this show when we talk about data and economics. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to mean for the study of economics itself. But what I am sure of is that this changes things. This fundamentally changes things. And in our view, CEO or holds another key role. Tesla stock climbed 2% on Monday. As a reminder, Elon Musk's pay at Tesla has been the center of a years-long legal battle. Back in 2018, the Tesla board approved a record-setting pay package for Musk worth up to $56 billion if certain milestones were met. It was the largest potential compensation opportunity ever observed in public markets. It was also 33 times higher than the nearest comparison, which was, by the way, Musk's prior compensation package. Shareholders approved the plan at the time, but a Tesla investor sued, claiming Musk had too much control over the board. Then in January 2024, a Delaware judge ruled that the pay plan was improperly granted and ordered that it be rescinded. The court said Tesla's board wasn't independent and Musk's influence dominates the decision-making process. The board has since appealed that ruling, and the case is still pending in Delaware's Supreme Court. So while that legal battle plays out, Tesla has offered Musk this new $29 billion package in order to, quote, keep Elon's energies focused. With the new shares, Musk would own nearly 16% of Tesla, a stake that would be worth more than $150 billion today. So to help us break down this latest compensation and what it means for Tesla, we are welcoming back Charles Elson, founding director of the Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware. Charles Elson, thank you very much for joining us again on Prof Markets.
Great to be with you again, Ed.
I would love to address you as Uncle Charles, but I'm told that's not professional, so I'm calling you Charles Elson.
That's what they call me.
I love it. I feel like Chris Cuomo in 2020.
Very true.
So Tesla has proposed this new package of $29 billion for Elon Musk. The question I have for you, where does this fit in terms of the legal dispute with the Delaware Court of Chancery? Does this solve the problem?
Well, no, it's an end run around the decision, basically, if you think about it. And the decision said this package was no good. It explained why. And suddenly a new package appears that basically is very similar to the old package. But it's done in a way that it looks like it's a new package. And they've said that if the Delaware court approves the old package, the Supreme Court approves it, then they'll drop this and it'll go back to the old. But if the Supreme Court doesn't and strikes it down, then this will be the new package. But remember, they moved from Delaware to Texas. And in Texas, there's a different sort of regime, if you will. In Delaware, any shareholder could sue to block this. In Texas, there's a new rule in Texas. It said only a 3% shareholder or above can sue derivatively, which is what this claim would be. So basically, if the shareholders approve it, it's bulletproof, which is really kind of, for the investors who oppose it, is really a very problematic. That's really why they should have, I thought, stayed in Delaware. But also, if you think about it, if you can simply pick up and move somewhere else to avoid a judicial ruling, there's something really wrong there. Actually, in the end, what it will do is, if you go to Texas and you can't bring an action, it just means people who own stock who are unhappy will, A, probably not invest in a venture that doesn't respect them, or B, if they do, it will be through debt contract, because a debt, you can always contract your way to remedies, really, and have it enforced by a court. Can't do that with equity. The court is critical to equity, protection of equity. And that's what Delaware was about. But obviously, someone thinks differently.
What would you say to the shareholders who say, no, we do want this? And there are many of those shareholders. They voted 77% that we want to give him the $56 billion. And point taken, I'm sure there are investors out there who say, no, that's too much, that's excessive. But I think, the counter argument to what you're saying is, the shareholders said, we like it. We like that package. The Delaware court says that doesn't make any sense. And I think a lot of people would say, well, why is it up to Delaware to decide what's reasonable? If the shareholders like it, then they can vote for it.
Well, I think the issue was protection of minority capital. Look, some shareholders did like it. A lot of them didn't and voted against it. Quite a few didn't and voted against it. And the danger is, if you basically give the minorities money away, next time you won't get minority capital. I mean, critical to the system is protection of all investors. And something like this, where a court has said the process that led to it was highly flawed, that they critiqued the independence or lack thereof of the board. And the sum, they said, was problematic because it didn't incentivize someone. This is the same story. Someone who has that much stock in the company doesn't need to be incentivized to stick with it. He's got, at this point, billions of dollars in the company. Why in the world do you have to incent him to stay?
Yeah, I just want to read you a quote from the board's statement, because this was the issue, was how do you incentivize him? And the court said, you don't need $56 billion to incentivize the guy to go to work every day. Here was the board's quote in their new letter. They said, quote, "Retaining Elon is more important than ever before. We are confident that this award will incentivize Elon to remain at Tesla." So they're essentially saying, this is the amount of money we need just to get him to stay there. That's what we need to pay him. So I guess my question to you is, one, do you believe that is a good faith argument from the board? And two, what do you think is the right number? What's the reasonable number to get a world-class talent like Elon? We got to give him his credit to stay at the company and keep working there.
Well, number one, I just find it very unusual that they said, well, this is what will keep him there. Otherwise, he will go. I don't believe he'll leave. I don't think it's it's certainly not in his interest to leave. And frankly, how do you know you're going to get what you pay for anyway? I mean, at this point, Tesla, yes, it hit heights, but we haven't seen such a fantastic Tesla of late. Tesla's got some real issues, and everyone knows that. So, and some of the issues, it was argued, may have been caused by him. His departure, the political issue, his actions hurt not just his own stake, but everyone else's. I just don't believe it takes something like that. And no one's that good. What happened? Let me ask you this. What happens if tomorrow he was crossing the street and gets hit by a bus? Does the whole world stop? Will Tesla stop if he's hit by a bus? Let's say he wakes up tomorrow and says, I just want to live on an island and I really don't care about anything. I'm going to go bring some coconuts and sit there. Goodbye, world. The world isn't stopped. No human being is so vital to the world that everything stops. I believe this approach is rather foolish. And frankly, if someone says to you, I'm threatened to leave or else, they're going to do it again. At some point, you got to say enough. Okay, go ahead. As I said, you may get hit by a bus one day and, you'll have to find someone, but usually you do.
Exactly. It seems as though that there is a cultish vibe around him, which the markets seem to agree is acceptable, and no one can imagine this world of a Tesla without Elon, and so they're willing to pay $30 billion to avoid that. But just to go back to the original question, you've had a lot of experience on a lot of different boards. You've worked with many CEOs. Again, what do you think is reasonable? What does make sense?
I think it has to be negotiated. It has to be a board that's independent of him, that represents the shareholders, period. And I think she found this board wasn't independent. And listen, it resulted in a negotiation, a fair negotiation, where both sides are trying to maximize their own position. Usually you get to the right place. And there's no set number. I doubt a real negotiation would produce numbers like this. Put it that way.
Yes.
Who would?
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate your time, Charles. I hope to have you on again soon. Yeah,
Always
thank you very much. Shares of American Eagle surged more than 23% yesterday after he applauded the brand's campaign featuring Sydney Sweeney. He wrote on Truth Social, quote, Sydney Sweeney, a registered Republican, has the hottest ad out there. It's for American Eagle, and the jeans are flying off the shelves. Go get him, Sydney. Now, why is he even talking about this? Well, I'm sure you know, but as a reminder, American Eagle launched this ad campaign titled Sydney Sweeney Has Great Genes.
Genes are passed down from parents to offspring, often determining traits like hair color, personality, and even eye color. My genes are blue.
Sydney Sweeney has great genes.
The ad got some backlash online. It prompted yet another culturally and racially charged debate. And then when Trump learned about Sydney Sweeney's political affiliation, apparently she's a Republican, he obviously had to get involved. Now, I have to be honest, I don't care about this debate at all. I think it's dumb and I think it's a waste of time. However, I do care about the way in which the markets are now playing a role in this debate and debates like this. The fact that American Eagle can accrue over $400 million in market cap in one day just because it is the subject of this cultural controversy. That is new. And I don't know exactly what to make of it, but I do know that it says something about this current moment in the markets. So to help us unpack this, our producer Claire spoke with Kyla Scanlon, author of In This Economy, How Money and Markets Really Work.
Yeah, I mean, all the meme stocks have been on a big tear recently, like any sort of attention toward like Krispy Kreme or GoDaddy, and the stocks are ready to roll. It seems like there's some excess capital in the markets that is able to go into these meme stocks. And with the American Eagle situation, I'm not surprised because President Trump is such a good attention harvester that essentially whatever he touches, it's going to go up in price. Trump coin is a key example there. And so it makes a lot of sense that this happened and that people would see him tweeting about it as a catalyst for the stock.
Do you think American Eagle planned for this kind of reaction? Do you think they saw it coming at all? Or did they sort of just stumble into this attention economy and play it well?
I think there's a good article on Adweek that touches on how important controversy is right now. Essentially, controversy is a commodity. Mm-hmm. And so if you can make a lot of people mad, you're probably going to have some elements of success because everybody's so polarized.
Right. It's almost like controversy is this cheat code in the attention economy. But my question is, will it actually translate to a sustainable strategy and convert into brand equity for American Eagle? I mean, Trump was saying jeans are flying off the shelves. I don't know if any of that's true, but do you think it could, translate into actual sales for them?
I mean, they lost almost $70 million in their first quarter of 2025 as a company. So I don't know if that a controversial ad is going to help them gain $70 million. I think that when we look at stocks that kind of play, or companies that play this controversy line, like maybe Rumble, for example, they don't tend to do that well. And so I think it kind of works as a short-term boost, but it often doesn't translate into any real business fundamental. Like, I think what's going on with American Eagle right here is a great example of a stock not necessarily reflecting the underlying company. The stock market is divorced from everyday experiences increasingly, like just does not reflect underlying fundamentals at all, for a lot of companies. And I think just this American Eagle situation is case in point for that. It's very much an example of it.
And final question, what do you make of the market's reaction to the latest with Trump throwing his support behind the ad? Do you think the market's saying, yes, we're into this anti-woke moment? Or is it more like traders are saying, this is ridiculous, hilarious, weird, we just want to make it even crazier and run the stock up?
I mean, it's interesting because I don't even know if it was an anti-woke moment. Like, the campaign was supposed to support a domestic violence charity, right? And so it seems like everybody just skewed the narrative totally out of control. But I think that for finance people, they see an opportunity in it. And there's a meme about it, Trump is tweeting about it. And so there's a lot of power behind that. And so I think the market is just looking for any sort of catalyst.
That was Kyla Scanlon, author of In This Economy and also a frequent guest on Prof G Markets. Whatever you think of the ad, I think it's important to simply observe what it has done to the stock price. To Kyla's point, it is just indisputable the extent to which attention has taken on a life of its own in our economy. Attention isn't just noise in the economy, it is the economy. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't really matter how you get it. It could be through controversy or through outrage or even a simple meme. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is that you obtain it. That's what matters today. We saw it with GameStop. We saw it with many of the stocks that Kyla mentioned. We saw it more recently with Astronomer and that whole Coldplay concert CEO debacle. And we're seeing it again today with American Eagle and Sydney Sweeney and now Trump. Now, does that mean American Eagle is a good investment? No, not at all. In fact, I'm waiting for the stock to come crashing back down. But it also doesn't mean that the stock couldn't rip another 50% this week. All it would take is another tweet from the president or another meme from the White House, and you could see another several $100 million in market value created overnight. That is genuinely possible, and that is just the world we live in. And the question is whether you really want to participate in that as an investor. Me personally, I'm good. I have no interest in participating, but it is certainly true the world of meme stocks is expanding, and the deal, which comes after 2 decades of talks, will phase out tariffs on the vast majority of goods. That move is expected to double European exports to India within the next 6 years. The timing of the deal is also telling. It landed just after President Trump's threats over Greenland's strained relations with Europe. Meanwhile, India faces US tariffs as high as 50% on key goods, which raises an important question. Are America's allies hedging their bets? Here to help us answer that, we are speaking with Liz Hoffman, business and finance editor at Semaphore. Liz, welcome back to Prof G Markets.
Hey, Ed.
So we want to get your reactions to this new trade deal confirmed between Europe and India. It'll phase out most of the tariffs. It's going to double the value of European exports to India within the next 6 years. People are calling it historic, the mother of all deals. Any initial reactions?
Yeah, I mean, unless you live in the EU or India, which is, in fact, a lot of people, I think the numbers will either bear out or not. But to me, sort of directionally, what this signals is that a lot of countries around the world, particularly these middle powers that are really big economies, but not sort of hegemon adjacent, are starting to realize that they can go around Washington rather than simply being forced to kind of knuckle under. And so you're starting to see these new trade patterns emerge, new trade alliances emerge. This deal has been years in the making. And the thing that got it over the finish line was Donald Trump picking fights all over the world.
My read on the situation is it's clear that America is, I guess, sticking up the finger to Europe and various other allies in various ways. We saw what happened in Davos, and now, just a few days later, there's this announcement of this deal. It looks like this is very much a reaction to what happened in Davos. You were at Davos. Is that the correct conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, look, the big story at Davos was Donald Trump, but the event that really stuck with me was a speech that the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, gave. I mean, really just like immediately a historic document, kind of a speech for the ages, is what Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, called it when I talked to him at the end of the week. And really, this was a call to arms to these middle powers to say, you know, there's been this rupture, he called it, in the world order, and we can either forge our own way, or really recede under that wave. And Carney had, I think, either just been or was on his. I think he'd just been in China, where he had signed a huge trade deal between Canada and China. That, taking a step back, is actually a remarkable alliance. You know, it wasn't that long ago, if you remember, there were these huge geopolitical tensions between Canada and China. Canada had arrested a Chinese Huawei executive. I mean, this was really fraught relations between the two countries. And now you have this big trade deal that, among other things, will bring Chinese EVs, these really fantastically futuristic, the tech is great, they are cheap electric vehicles, to Canada, right on America's doorstep. And it all felt like a bit of a middle finger to Donald Trump. Also, he gave like the first couple of minutes of the speech in French, which really felt like standing up for a kind of multilateralism and globalism that Donald Trump has really tried to dismantle. So, that was kind of a call to arms. And then right on the back end of it, we see this huge trade deal between India and the EU. And these are goods that, in a different tariff regime would be headed here. And will not be because of the tariffs that the White House has put on, particularly India.
I recently saw Mark Carney spoke about that speech, which, as you say, I mean, everyone considered it to be groundbreaking. I've seen Canadians saying it's the best speech that Prime Minister of Canada has ever given. Apparently, he told the president, "I meant what I said." Those were his words. It seems like he is doubling down on this. It appears that perhaps Europe is also doubling down on this position. We're going to find allies elsewhere. Do you expect that we will see more of these trade deals? I mean, it seemed like maybe the ball was starting to get rolling. I was wondering whether it would stop in 2026, but it appears to be accelerating. Would you agree with that?
I would. The EU has, opened in extended trade talks with some of their other partners. The thing that really crystallized for Europe in particular, but for a lot of other countries, when Donald Trump started this trade war back in the spring of 2025, was they said, oh, we are really reliant on the U.S., right? I mean, and that's what gave the White House so much of its power on the way in. And they had some early success striking some of these trade deals. But the alternative, if you're Europe or India or Japan or Canada, is to say, oh, we are too reliant on the U.S. and to go find partners elsewhere. And, the world is a big place, and it is fragmenting. One word that was, Davos always coins these slightly ridiculous phrases. And one that I heard a lot last week was mini-lateralism, kind of as a replacement for multilateralism, and that these big global trade webs that largely flowed through the United States, kind of as a as a global protector and hegemon and kind of, good corporate citizen, are being replaced by these more localized, more bilateral agreements and arrangements that increasingly are going to flow outside of Washington and around Washington. Probably, at least, to some degree in the near term, to the detriment of American.
Added fuel to the sector-wide sell-off. CVS Health closed down 14%, United Health dropped nearly 20%, and Humana fell 21%. Here to help us break down this plan and what it means for the future of health insurance in America, we are speaking with Michael Ha, Senior Research Analyst at Baird. Michael, thank you for joining us on Prof G Markets.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So this proposal, this plan, it's a 0.09% payment increase for Medicare Advantage plans in 2027. Not really clear what that even means, but I'm looking at CVS Health, United Health, Humana. All of these stocks are cratering right now. Why is this happening?
Great question. And let me take it at a very high level, and then I'll drill in. And basically, Medicare, I'll take it at the highest level. Medicare is health insurance for seniors over the age of 65. So think of it as healthcare. U.S. healthcare is about a $4 to $5 trillion market. Medicare itself is about a quarter of that, right? Call it $1 trillion. So when you think about how important of a role it plays in the overall healthcare within the U.S., it's significant. And your largest players are your United Health, your Humana, your CVS, the names that you just called out, and they're all down close to 20%. So the way to think about it is, this is run by the federal government, and how their pricing works is clearly volume price, volumes of membership. Pricing is determined by the federal government under HHS via a department called CMS. And every year in January, they provide a proposed rate notice, call it the advance rate notice. And basically, if there's a benchmark rate that every health plan gets for a senior, that rate should, in theory, every year go up to track cost trend. And long story short is a flat rate increase, 0.9%, like you mentioned, it does not cut it. Because right now, the cost trend environment in Medicare Advantage world, it's mid-single digit to high single digit. So 1% rate increase, there's a huge delta. It's incredibly insufficient. And what the importance of this is, this might catalyze into 2027, because remember, this rate notice is for 27, seniors getting their benefits cut across the board, and it impacting membership next year in a very significant way. Because remember, if the health insurers are getting hit on rate and revenue, their levers are benefits. That's the main lever right there.
I was going to ask you what are the implications for the consumer? Whenever I see something like this, my sort of knee-jerk reaction is, oh, he's, pulling down profits for these healthcare companies. Maybe that means more money in the consumer's pockets, less money in the insurance company's pocket. Maybe that's why the stock's down, but it sounds like that's actually not right. This could negatively impact the consumer. Is that right?
Exactly. Negatively will impact the consumer and negatively impacts the health insurance companies themselves. And when you think about it, benefits, right? The ones that you can really feel and that's most tangible to you, right? It might be your dental benefits, your vision, things of that nature for seniors matter a lot. And there's a multitude of them. So it'll be felt, it'll be very impactful to 2027. And actually, this is what has been happening, transpiring over the past couple of years, because under Biden's administration, rates were terrible. They were abysmal. They were similar to what we were seeing in 2027. So what we have already seen over the past 2 years, and you can look at CVS's stock chart, Humana's stock chart, United's now, is that the rates have been insufficient to match trends. And it's wreaked havoc on health insurance. And if you look at seniors and membership, I mean, for personally, my father had a CVS health plan and he was looking to re-enroll, but they cut the plan. So that's what you're seeing right now across health insurers. They're cutting benefits, they're cutting plans, they're sculpting their geographic markets. They're doing what they can to maintain margins in an environment where rates are, quite frankly, very insufficient.
How much of this has to do with Trump's great healthcare plan that he announced just the other week? I mean, when he proposed this, he put this proposal out there. We read through it. We couldn't really see much detail at all. And it appears that the markets agreed. I mean, the consensus among the markets was, this doesn't really mean anything. This isn't going to mean much change. And that's why there wasn't really a reaction from the markets. But now we're seeing, a huge reaction. What is the relationship between what we saw today and the great healthcare plan that was announced a couple of weeks ago? Is there a relationship?
A loose relationship. When we think about the great healthcare plan, Trump, his focus is laser focused on something called the ACA, the exchange marketplace that was created during the Affordable Care Act for individuals, where now there's over 20 million people enrolled. So this is different from Medicare Advantage, right? There's 3 subsegments within health insurance. There's Medicare Advantage, which we're talking about. There's Medicaid for low-income individuals, and then there's commercial, employer and individual. So when Trump is making his remarks, the Great Healthcare Act plan, he's talking about commercial and individual. So with Medicare Advantage, it's different. I think for Trump, he really has 2 goals. And one, it's cutting premiums for the individual marketplace and passing money back to them, perhaps via HSAs or checks. And for Medicare Advantage and everything, Medicaid as well, he wants to eliminate fraud, reduce waste. And when you think about Medicare Advantage and how it relates to what just happened last night, this rate notice, the biggest surprise within this rate notice is what they're doing on risk model changes. And I know this is going to be very technical and granular, but it's important to understand, because what the government believes is that there's a lot of fraud in risk coding, in risk adjustment. There's been a lot of articles from Wall Street Journal, for example, about companies like United Health, Optum Health, improperly risk coding and if you bear with me for 15 seconds, I'll explain why it matters. So we mentioned how every Medicare Advantage plan gets paid a benchmark rate for every senior. And let's call it even number, $1,000 per member per month, so $12,000 annually. But it's unfair if, for example, your member might have diabetes and cancer and AIDS. You're incurring much more costs. So as a health plan, you should be getting paid more to match the utilization, which is why the government created something called a risk score. And basically, it's a multiplier effect. If you're healthy, you might be 1.0 times 1,000. But if you have a multitude of comorbidities, that might be 2.0. That might be 10.0 times 1,000. And this risk score is justified by health insurers collecting codes to justify your health status. And there are a lot of players in the game, a lot of health insurers who've been very aggressive arbitraging that risk code payment mechanism, because it's clearly so impactful to revenue, drops right to bottom line. So to basically circle back, this rate notice, the most surprising impact is what it's done to risk adjustment and tightening it, making it less difficult to be aggressive, if you will. So you're seeing the most aggressive risk coders like United Health seeing the biggest impact today, while conversely, plans like Alignment Health, ticker ALHC, my favorite plan, the best Medicare Advantage plan in the country, most conservative in risk code, they're seeing much less of an impact. So I think it's important to really focus on that point.
It seems like, just if I were to translate pretty simply, it seems like that's maybe a good thing, no? If we're cracking down on those practices that's been reported on, is that not something to get behind?
It is a good thing. I agree. I think crackdown on all fraud across all of health insurance is a positive, but the implication is if health plans get hit on revenue and earnings, they're going to look to find it somewhere. And unfortunately, it'll be seniors' benefits. So that'll be the first toggle. And it will save the government money. However, it will impact seniors. So, positives and negatives to this.
Michael Ha, Senior Research Analyst at Baird. Michael, appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
It's published on Monday. It's a fascinating essay. However, there is a catch, and that is that the essay is also 38 pages and 20,000 words long. It also features no charts, no graphics. It is a giant wall of text, and therefore it is highly unreadable. So we decided to do the hard part, and we read the whole thing. That way, you don't have to. So here is our summary of Dario Amadei's essay. These are the cliff notes. So the first section is called I'm Sorry, Dave, and that is a reference to the famous scene in 2001 Space Odyssey where Hal, the AI system, decides to betray Dave, the astronaut, and he tries to kill him. And Amadei's point in this section is that AI pulling a Hal, or betraying its creator, betraying humanity, his point is that that is actually possible. In fact, tests have shown that Claude, Anthropic's chatbot, can, in certain situations, engage in blackmail and deception. They have seen this, and that is obviously very scary. And so Amadei explains how we should navigate this. One suggestion is that AI companies should be more transparent about their models and how they work. And the other suggestion, the more important suggestion perhaps, is that we need real legislation to address this problem. And this is a theme that continues throughout the piece. The next section is about AI and nuclear weapons, AI and biological attacks, systems breaches, all the sci-fi stuff that is, again, very possible in a world of superintelligence. Amadei explains how Anthropic is working to prevent this, how they're investing more money to build guardrails within their AI systems. And he ends again with another call for more regulation, more oversight in America. Next, he discusses what would happen if authoritarian governments started to use AI. He talks about the dangers of autonomous weapons, mass surveillance, AI-generated propaganda. His solutions here are a little bit vague, but ultimately the point is something that I think most of us can agree on, and that is authoritarians plus AI is a pretty bad combo. Now, the fourth risk is one we've discussed before. Specifically, what will AI do to jobs? What will it do to the job market? And his view is very clear. It will do a lot. He predicts AI could displace roughly half of white-collar jobs in the next 5 years. He also discusses how this could worsen inequality and how the probability of a, quote, economic concentration of power is actually rising quite fast. Finally, the last section discusses all the potential downstream effects of AI. Maybe we start to integrate AI into our biology. Maybe we become functionally dependent on AI. Maybe humans lose their sense of purpose altogether, etc., etc. The biggest message from the whole essay, however, is quite simple. The message is that AI needs more regulation. It needs more oversight. It needs more guardrails. AI needs policy that recognizes just how dangerous it could really be. And what's striking about this isn't necessarily the message. I think a lot of people know that. What is striking is from whom that message is coming. It's not coming from a regulator or a lawmaker or a senator. It's coming from the CEO of one of the largest AI companies in the world. The guy who makes AI is literally begging his own government to regulate AI. And that's significant. That tells you something about the state of our government and its approach to AI. The problem isn't even that America has a bad AI strategy. The problem is that America doesn't have an AI strategy, and that is potentially even scarier. Now, one last note before we go here. One of Amadei's complaints in the essay is that this whole AI conversation has been dominated by the wrong people. It's been dominated by sensationalists and doomers and these figures on social media who aren't really asking the right questions. He says, quote, "The least sensible voices rose to the top." And personally, I would probably agree with him. But we should also recognize why those voices rose to the top. And the reason is because those voices are good at social media. They're good at getting a message across. And that is something that Anthropic should also recognize. So my unsolicited advice to Dario Amadei, if you're listening, I liked your comments. We think your message is a good one. But enough with the 38-page essays. Go fight this battle where the battles are actually being fought. Get on TikTok, get on Instagram, get on YouTube. Talk to the camera, tighten your message, and maybe throw in some charts, maybe throw in some visuals. The problem isn't that people aren't listening to you. The problem is that people don't even hear you. You're not even in the same room as them. So if you want to win this game of attention, unfortunately, you have to play by the rules. So my advice Dario Amade, it's time to put...
While the US builds the ultra-premium iPhone, powerful but too expensive to dominate globally. Why the latest spat between Japan and China could reshape the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region, and how Starbucks and the coffee wars reveal the fierce fight for China's consumer market. All right, let's get right into it. Right now, the biggest story in tech may be the one the US didn't see coming. China's low-cost, open-source AI is suddenly everywhere in Silicon Valley. While the US is spending billions of dollars building ever bigger models and data centers and inflating what some analysts say looks like an AI bubble, China is doing the exact opposite, it seems, cutting prices, opting for open sourcing weights, and shipping models that are cheaper, lighter, and surprisingly competitive. And American companies are flocking to them. Airbnb CEO says his team ditched ChatGPT for Alibaba's Qwen model because it's quote-unquote fast and cheap. Venture firms are switching to Moonshot's Kimi LLM, and developer data show nearly half of the most used models in the US last week were Chinese. Alibaba just slashed prices on its flagship model again as part of a full-blown AI price war, and a sign that involution has come to Chinese AI. Former Google CEO Eric Schmidt is warning that most countries may end up using Chinese models simply because they're free. James, we've talked a lot about, I think, Chinese AI over the last few weeks, and I definitely think I'm very excited to see the models that are coming out of the mainland, but also the fact that the West is catching up to this theme that we've been talking about for a while, which is, don't write off Chinese AI. They are going to go for it in a very different model. And I think the recent announcements from these tech companies, some even, I would say, pretty big startups that are using and relying Chinese LLMs, is pretty dramatic. And I think it's a different narrative than what we've been seeing in the last few years. I just want to go right into it and see what your take is on this Chinese model of AI, and whether or not this kind of Android AI approach to making cheaper, faster, more efficient models is ultimately going to win out in a global race between China and the US of AI.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Alice. I've started to notice just in recent days, actually, that people are using the word bubble with regard to America's AI efforts quite a bit more now. I think in the past they've been reluctant to do that. My own take is that this is still very far from conventional wisdom, and the US-China AI race is going to be a very long-run thing. We can't call it yet. There's going to be many ups and downs and fits and starts. But as things stand right now, I would say that some big names in the US are looking quite bubbly. And I think the key point is this. The bubbly aspects of American AI, as I see it, are made in China, by which I mean that China's approach to AI is to build AI models at a much lower cost than we can find in the US. Also, the cost of using those Chinese AI models is much lower. And crucially, the performance of the Chinese AI models is kind of just as good or catching up to US standards at the moment. So I think that that is the reason why we saw Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, very recently say, as you've already mentioned, the vast majority of governments and countries who don't have the kind of money that the West has will end up standardizing by using Chinese models, not because they're better, but because they're free. So I think really we're entering a very interesting phase in the US-China AI race. I should just mention before I pass it back to you, Alice, that there needs to be a little bit of nuance on this. Not all US LLMs are closed source, and not all Chinese large language models are open source. So it's a mixed picture. We've got Llama from Meta, we've got Phi from Microsoft, and Gemma from Google. All of those are open source. And of course, it's famous that many of the big and successful Chinese models, such as DeepSeek and Qwen, as you already mentioned, are open source too. But I just want to make that clear. It's a variegated picture. It's not the case that everything done in China is open source and everything done in the US is closed source. I just want to leave you with one extraordinary statistic, and that is that the latest Chinese AI sensation, which is called Kimi K2, cost just a fraction of what it would cost to train an AI model in America. It cost about 4.6 million US dollars. That is just a tiny fraction of what OpenAI has been investing in its large language models over in the US. But how do you see this, Alice? Do you think that, it's too early to call, or do you think that the American model is looking bubbly and the Chinese model is looking lean and mean?
I think that's a great way to phrase it. Bubbly versus lean and mean. I think I'm more in the camp of that kind of narrative, although with the caveat that, as we've previously talked about, James, the US has thrown billions of capex into the data center rollout, into leading edge LLMs, into the frontier labs and hyperscalers. And as a result, I think is probably going to be further along in the AGI, artificial general intelligence race, or superintelligence, as we previously mentioned. But the Chinese model, to your point, James, is leaner and meaner in the sense that, it is doing these models more efficiently, much cheaper to train. What was interesting for me to notice, and you already mentioned it, James, is that and not only are they cheaper on the inference costs, but also on the training costs. I remember meeting Kai-Fu Lee, the father of AI in China, who wrote that famous book, AI Superpowers, which seems like a lifetime ago, but I highly recommend that read, I believe in 2018, so before this really ramped up as a serious issue. And he had said at the time, a year and a half ago, that China may not be able to compete on training costs because the US has dedicated a huge amount of capex towards training, and it has some of the best data sets and training models in the world. But China can rapidly decrease the inference costs. Now it seems like they've decreased both the inference and training costs. To your point, the Kimi K2 open source model is just $4.6 million, as you say. That's 1,500 times less than what OpenAI spent on R&D this year. And again, just to follow up on your point, James, so that listeners can appreciate this, I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say that China is leading the way on open source. I've been talking to some AI scientists more recently who've said that actually the majority of the quote unquote open source models are really open weight, meaning that the underlying code and data set are not freely available, but the weights or the training parameters are. That's the difference between an open weight versus an open source. But the fact of the matter remains that China is going through what I see as a Cambrian explosion in terms of different LLMs. And we've talked about this theme of involution, of price wars, of excess capacity, of hyper competition. I think this is already starting to be played out in the Chinese context, where you have a lot of different LLMs in the race or in the ring. Kimi just overtook QN and DeepSeek very recently in terms of its parameters and performance. I think the fact that China is being used, its LLMs are being used by American companies, is a pretty telling and a compelling sign that consumers are driven by price. And the fact that these LLMs can be cheaper than their American counterparts, I think, is making them more desirable, even amongst some of these Western companies, which is why, I find that the recent talk about Chinese LLMs being competitive is coming at a time in which a lot of people watching Wall Street are very worried about the AI bubble in the US. I think the two of them coexisting as narratives is not a coincidence. But actually, one question I do have for you, James, is have you actually used the different models? I've been playing around a little bit across the different models from the US and China, but I want to get a sense of what you've experienced.
Yeah, I have actually. I've used DeepSeek quite a lot. I continue to use DeepSeek quite a lot. Obviously, I've used ChatGPT quite a bit, and I've just started to play around with Kimi as well. To be honest with you, I'm using it at such a low level that I don't really notice that much of a difference. I'm sort of using it as a dictionary, really, and as a database. Yeah, I mean, they're all pretty good. I have noticed that the DeepSeek results are a little bit skewed away from politically sensitive topics that you might expect from a Chinese LLM, but I haven't noticed anything too egregious, I must say. But there is this question about security, which is hanging in the background. And I think that a lot of people are concerned by the question of security with regard to Chinese large language models. I should cite an article by the Financial Times just recently that says that Alibaba provides tech support for the Chinese military against targets in the United States. Now, I need to be very careful about this. The claims, which couldn't be independently verified by the FT, were rejected very forcefully by Alibaba. They said that this information leaked from your source is complete nonsense. So that's a very strong denial. But there is always going to be this